reason that the right has lost is because we think individually and the left thinks institutionally. We like to debate people on a one-on-one level. We'll go door to door. We'll talk to anybody. We'll have a discussion with people on that individual level. Whenever you see somebody getting sucked into a Facebook conversation with a leftist friend who's never going to be convinced, it's always a conservative. You don't see leftists getting sucked into these conversations because leftists are too busy taking over the media. The left thinks institutionally. The left wants a top-down dictation of policy. They understand something that we don't. Because they think institutionally, because we don't think in terms of top-down control, and the left is fond of doing so, they think in terms of, instead of let's debate one-on-one, we'll take over the university system, and then we'll use it as a club to leverage millions of young people to believe that right-wingers are bad human beings. Or we'll take over Hollywood, and then we will force everybody who is mildly conservative out of Hollywood in order to leverage our points of view down the throats of the American people. They do it with regard to nonprofits, too. They combine with the government. Look at what President Obama just did in shifting his campaign into a 501c4 lobbying group. He also opened the door, by the way, in an executive order to actually funding that lobbying group from the government. President Obama is somebody who really understands the battle. He understands the fight. He's very, very smart. And he understands that he can use outside institutions like Media Matters. He can use outside institutions like Organizing for Action, what was Obama for America. He can use those institutions to push positions he cannot do as President of the United States. He combines with those institutions to push forward that agenda and to silence people and to launch boycotts and secondary boycotts against anybody who disagrees. We now live in a country where if you abide by the basic laws of economics, you are an enemy of this administration. If you are Phil Mickelson and you say, the taxes in California are too high, I'm leaving, then you are told that you are somehow a bad person. There's something wrong with you. Now, there are a lot of people who have left California because the taxes are too high. I'm paying those high taxes. I think every day about whether to leave California because of the tax rate. That's because economics exist. The left doesn't think they do. So when Wendy says, you know, Obamacare is going to cost money, perhaps we'll have to cut back hours, and the left responds with, if you do that, we'll boycott you. That is not a logical, coherent economic argument. That is an argument that if you disagree with the effects even of what Obama's policies do, with what leftist policies do, then there's something wrong with you. You made a moral decision to cut back those hours, not an economic decision to cut back those hours. Leaving aside the institutional bullies for a second, there are several types of bullying that the left loves to engage in. Their favorite, of course, is racial bullying. They love it. It's their favorite thing. The reason for that is that the left's philosophy is based almost solely and completely at this point on the idea that they stand up for victimized groups. Everything they do is to stand up on behalf of some victimized minority. Blacks, Jews, gays, women, it doesn't matter. If you're a minority, they're standing up for you. What that means is that if we oppose their policies, by necessity, the logic is, we hate blacks, gays, Jews, and women. And that is sort of the philosophy that they trot out. It also means that they treat people who are apostates as though there's something wrong with them. They're not. If you're Jewish and you're a conservative, as I am, you're not a real Jew, because that gives the lie to their entire agenda. If it turns out that not all Jews agree with them, then how can they claim to be standing up for all of these victimized minorities? If Larry Elder is a black man and disagrees with them, then it's because he's not a good black man. He's not good at being a black man. He's betrayed his race. That is the philosophy of the left when it comes to race. Now, what they do, the tactics are really what's interesting here. We all know that they use the term racism far too often. They label things racist that are not even close to racist. Voter ID, not racist. But the left says that you're a racist if you think that maybe, just maybe, they should check the name on the voter form with your ID to make sure that you're not voting for Eric Holder, right? I mean, they think that is a racist thing. What they love to do, their favorite tactic, though, is to take a single flashpoint incident, use the media to blow this up into like the biggest thing that ever happened in the history of humanity, imply that all of America is based on the same racism that caused this incident, and then say, and the solution to that racism is liberalism. Now, one of the best examples we saw of that was last year in the George Zimmerman case. Right? The George Zimmerman case was the greatest case of media malpractice, I think, in American history. I mean, the only one that would even come close is Walter Duranty trying to cover up genocide in the Ukraine. But the attempt by the media, a very clear attempt, to frame George Zimmerman, really frame him, it was obvious and it was politically motivated. It was obvious what they were trying to do. What actually happened in the George Zimmerman case is a Hispanic man was trailing a black man that he thought was engaged in possible criminal or suspicious behavior. He called 911. He got out of his car. When he turned around and went back to his car, he was confronted by the black man, who proceeded to pound this man's head into the ground until he shot him. That is what actually happened. Every police investigation has shown that is what happened. There is nothing to contradict George Zimmerman's account of events. There's not one shred of evidence to contradict George Zimmerman's account of events, which is why he was released in the first place. The media promptly turned this into what Jesse Jackson termed it as: white man tracks down black man, shoots him in back of head. He wasn't shot in the back of the head. He was shot in the chest. George Zimmerman was severely injured in that fight. He was having his head pounded against the pavement. There were pictures of it. The way the media played it is that George Zimmerman had never been injured. George Zimmerman was stalking him for fun and just decided to shoot a black guy for no reason. And they cut the 911 tapes to make it look like that. Remember, now NBC's being sued because of that. They took the 911 tape in which George Zimmerman was specifically asked, what is the race of the person that you are following? He said he's black. The NBC cut that tape so that what it sounds like George Zimmerman is saying is, he looks suspicious, he's black. They cut out the entire exchange with the dispatcher. He had to be prompted for the race. Now, the reason that that mattered was that they used this Flashpoint incident as an excuse to push liberal policy. Here's how it works. They send Al Sharpton down there to talk about how the Sanford Police Department is massively racist, and that, in general, is just a symptom of the unbelievable racism that pervades America. It's still a huge problem in America. Racism happens all the time. As you know, President Obama and many others put it, really, Al Sharpton did this a lot. And people in Congress walking on the floor of the House with hoodies. The argument that they were making is that this is just one black guy that this happened to. It happens all the time. White people track down black people and they kill them. That's the kind of country that we live in. Racism is just as bad, if not worse than it was back in 1975. This argument rose all the way to the level of the presidency, right? With the president saying that if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin, which is eminently untrue. Trayvon Martin, if you saw the current pictures of him, was tattooed. Trayvon Martin, if you saw the current pictures of him, had a grill. I highly doubt you're going to see Sasha and Malia with tattoos or a grill anytime in the near future. But the point that Obama was making was that essentially all black people are treated the same by white people in this country. This is a racist country, and therefore, if you don't believe in my political prescriptions, that's because you hate me for the same reason that George Zimmerman hated Trayvon Martin. It's because I'm black. There was also a secondary attempt here that was really interesting. There's a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. Big group, a lot of corporations fund it. They push kind of quasi-conservative principles all over the country. One of the things that they had pushed was something called the Stand Your Ground Law. Now, you all remember with George Zimmerman, the media played it as though George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin, turned around and said to the police, hey, stand your ground. You know, it's the law, stand your ground. George Zimmerman didn't even know about this. I've talked with his family. He didn't know about the Stand Your Ground Law. The police didn't cite him, didn't free him under the Stand Your Ground Law. They freed him because there was no probable cause to keep him there. But what this was, this whole all-out assault on the Stand Your Ground Law, which is a law that says that if you're attacked, you don't have to retreat. You can fight back. The whole point of that attack was to leverage it against ALEC, which was an institutional opponent of the Obama administration. ALEC was a big fan of voter ID. ALEC had opposed many elements of Obamacare, and so ALEC had to be finished. And the way to do that was to say that ALEC was somehow responsible for this murder, this horrible racial murder that happened in Sanford, Florida. And by doing that, they actually then they went to Color of Change and Media Matters and all these groups that we mentioned before, and they had them leverage a boycott against ALEC. ALEC was so heavily boycotted that they had to pull off the Stand Your Ground laws completely. They cut back on their voter ID efforts, and they were and people actually pulled their money. I mean, Coke pulled its money from them. There were big corporations that didn't want any piece of this and pulled their cash. The left is interested only in silencing people with this sort of stuff. That is their main focus. And they think institutionally. They're very clever. What they're doing with this gun control stuff, this isn't about gun control. They're not going to pass one shred of this. What this is about is targeting the NRA and demonizing the NRA so that that institutional opponent goes away. Think about it for half a second. What did the NRA have to do with Sandy Hook? The answer is nothing. They had nothing to do with Sandy Hook. Connecticut is one of the most heavily gun-regulated states in the country. The NRA had not written any of the legislation in Connecticut. The NRA is a privately funded institution that receives no tax dollars. I didn't see anyone from the ACLU on David Gregory being forced to explain why violent video games are okay under the First Amendment. Did you? Did you see anybody being grilled from the ACLU about that? I missed it. But they were grilling the head of the NRA and saying, you need to change your position. He's the head of an interest group. It's his job not to change his position. But the left expects that he's going to, and they're going to demonize him until he does because the NRA must be finished. This is their tactical maneuver. We see it on every front. We see it from class warfare on the fiscal cliff. It turns out that we don't want what's best for Americans. We just want to help rich folks. It turns out that, when it comes to sexual politics, it's not that we believe, for good reason, in traditional marriage, for example. It's not that we believe that a child deserves a mother and a father. None of that's true. It's just that we hate gay people, and that makes us horrible and inhumane, and we're just terrible human beings. And we see it with regard to God and secularism. If you believe in God and you believe that your values ought to be expressed in the public square in even the most minute way, it is because you are a thug who wants to hurt people. Now, what all of this does is it justifies the most vile tactics on the left. I think a good example of this, I don't know how many of you saw my interview with Piers Morgan on CNN. Piers is a very good example of this. What Piers does, his tactic has always been to go up there and then say that whoever opposes him on gun policy, he did this to Newt Gingrich last night, whoever opposes him on gun policy, it's because they don't give a damn about the dead kids in Sandy Hook. It is a vile, reprehensible, disgusting tactic. And he uses it on a regular basis. But it really is a microcosm of what the left does on a regular basis. I can't remember the last time that the left didn't use this tactic. When President Obama trots out 7-year-olds to stand behind him as he's announcing gun control legislation, and then he puts on the White House website videos of these same 7-year-olds reading letters to the president, clearly written by their parents. And this is supposed to be a substitute for policy. I'm unaware of the point at which 7-year-olds became the best guide to solving political problems in this country. If a 40-year-old thinks like a 7-year-old, there's something wrong with them. And yet we are supposed to make policy like a 7-year-old would. So when you have a little girl in a red dress shouting into the camera, no guns, no guns, no guns, no guns, as President Obama does, we are supposed to